Hey everybody, welcome. Today we're talking about vibrato and essentially just all the different kinds of hacks and tricks that we can have in order to get our vibrato going, figure out how to control it, various things that we can just do with our vibrato skills in general. Um, so, oh hi, welcome. I'm doing all right. In general, we're going to talk about just what vibrato is, but also just some particular little tricks that people have done to help their students find vibrato. It does take some patience and time, like anything else, but as I always say with vibrato, it is a product of natural, healthy singing, and so it's something that you'll often observe in your voice first. And knowing or seeing what sort of your vibrato is doing often tells you a lot about what's going on with your voice as well. Let me just point out what it is, just for anyone who's new to all of this, as there's lots of terms in singing. Vibrato is when your voice oscillates around a pitch rather than singing just sort of straight on the pitch. And so we call it vibrato, and straight tone are these two sort of sides. So straight tone, if I were singing a note, it doesn't oscillate. It's like ah. There might be a little bit of shimmer and sort of changes, as it's hard to get completely straight tone, and we'll talk about that. Ultimately, it's more of our perception of what's happening. And then vibrato sounds like this. So it's like, yeah. You hear that sort of zing zing around the pitch. Everyone has a slightly different kind of sound to their vibrato, and there's a lot of variation with that. So again, straight tone is basically just straight on the pitch. It might kind of waver a little bit. And then vibrato is when you get that really nice, sort of clean kind of sine wave like sound. So for some people, what's hard about vibrato is because it's a product of healthy singing, it's not something that you can just at first kind of force to happen. You have to sort of discover it. It's ultimately a balanced state and a sustain. And that's sort of what we want to talk about. It's the way that the body finds balance with the muscles so that they're all kind of oscillating and vibrating together. And often when this happens and there's a handoff of muscles moving back and forth, we get this extra spike of the overtone sound. So you're going to get extra ring, and it's often associated with increasing volume in your sound in general. So it'll make your voice bigger. So let's talk about how we can turn on vibrato. So I say it's a product of healthy singing, and there's two main concepts we want to talk about that we want to bring into balance to get vibrato to happen. The first thing is space, and the second thing is spin. When people are talking about space, they're often talking about getting the right kind of shape. It's not that bigger and more space is always better, but we want the right kind of shape for our vocal track, and that gets the right kind of overtones to accentuate. So that's the space part of it. And then the other side of it is the spin. And that's actually what we do with our lower abdominal support. When you get the good combination of these two forces, vibrato starts to occur. It typically happens a lot of the time for people at the ends of their phrases. So that's something also to pay attention to. As I go through all of this, this is going to be a lot of like listing different tricks and things that work for people. Not every trick is going to work for you, and it's a matter of like a tool belt. So go through them and see what works. Um, what part do you want me to repeat again about sort of space and spin? Right, and we're gonna go over this concept again too. We've got space, which is about the shape of the vocal tract, and then we've got spin. Good, yeah, that's what I thought. And we've got spin, which is about our lower abdominal support and the right kind of breath pressure we have. When we have these two forces together, we start to get vibrato to occur. Also, when we talk about space, I think an important concept is just thinking about release and relaxation of these muscles. Usually the external muscles around our larynx, if we're holding them and there's lots of tension and we're out of alignment, then we compromise the right kind of space, and that can block our vibrato from happening. So we'll talk about certain kinds of tensions that can stop vibrato, and that can be a trick to help achieve vibrato again. So we'll talk about different aspects of this, the space and the spin, and sort of the exercises that we can do to get it to start. So I like to always kind of think of this as a flow, but you can make ultimately your own flow as you go. And please respond with any things that you found have been helpful for finding and understanding your vibrato, because that's always great to add into the mix. And I can talk about maybe what's going on there as well, because there aren't just like, one size fits all for what happens and how your vibrato gets working and how to control and manipulate it in the right way. So we'll also talk about some of the sort of signs that you're maybe forcing your vibrato, which is not sustainable and usually leads to a lot of other kind of tension things. So this is sort of a state that you drop into again. So the first thing we want to talk about is a little bit with the space concept. So with space, you have to be careful because the concept can make people sometimes artificially stretch and hold things. And that's actually going to add to tension. So that's why I talk about space and relaxation being really intricately connected. But one thing that you can do, again, within limits, so you don't want to overcompensate as you do this, is when we take our normal sort of breath, we can get our larynx to just drop for a little bit. And you don't want to press this down because that's going to lead to certain kinds of throat and tongue tension. But it's a great way to check in with what's happening here. When our larynx is riding up really high, that's compromising how much space we can have. So even just as a first exercise, you can take a moment and just get comfortable with your larynx. Don't overly wrench this, but just gently move it around and get a sense of sort of where the features are. And you'll notice as you're trying to relax your throat and move it, your tongue and your jaw also has to get a little more open. Um, yes, so when we're talking about space, it's about the appropriate space for each kind of vowel format to happen. And so that's why it's not just always wide open space, but in general, we want release and an open internal space no matter what shape we're creating. If it's pinching, then we tend to block the vibration of our vocal folds. So that's why like this concept of space can actually be a little misleading for people. It's more of a perceptive term about the sensation of release and openness in the back with our vocal tract. So even just right when you're gently sort of massaging and moving your larynx, you'll know your tongue and your jaw has to kind of relax as well. So I like to call this the neutral larynx concept. And it's a great way to just release any sort of excess holding or tension here. And it'll help you start to find resonance and all these other things as we go. So in the classical world, a lot of people talk about a lowered larynx and having that just be a little more relaxed. But if you're pressing it down, that's also a form of tension. So it can go too far, actually. So what I want you to practice is if you're just taking in a nice belly breath, see if you can get that to drop a little bit, and then it's going to float back up as you start singing or talking, and that's totally fine. It's just a way to kind of refresh it. And you can actually also refresh it the other way by swallowing. If you go like, you'll notice that it kind of goes up for a second and then relaxes back down. And the key aim here is to get flexibility so that the larynx can just kind of float. Again, why this is so important, and I want to talk about it right away. And this is kind of goes in the physical side of the practice that I always talk about, like stretching and working with your alignment, is when vibrato is occurring, these sort of suspended muscles around the larynx are going to start to oscillate a little bit. We don't want other things to oscillate, like our jaw and too much of our sort of head and neck or chest or anything like that. But there is sort of a gentle oscillation that's naturally happening. We don't need to force it. But if you keep your larynx and everything very relaxed, it's more likely that that's going to start happening. So you can see if you have a lot of tension in your voice, it can be sometimes harder to achieve vibrato. And thus, as you relax and open up your voice and get in control of the right muscles, vibrato starts to occur more. So again, you can take this neutral larynx concept of relaxing this part, and then the shapes can open and close in various ways up here, but the larynx itself is just sort of gentle and relaxed and floating. So play around with this. You can, as you swallow, feel it go up as you take in a breath. You can feel it kind of drop down a little bit, and you can massage it around just a little bit, not too forcefully, just to make sure that it's relaxed and floating. And then I do this kind of thing too, right? Making sure I can move my head, neck around the whole mechanism, relaxing the shoulders as well. So that's our sort of default state, is this neutral larynx. Let's start to explore getting a little more of this sort of rounded back space as well. So vibrato tends to happen better when we have more of this back part of our vocal tract open and relaxed. And if our alignment's out like this, we're kind of pinching that area. So that's why we always want to watch for that. So first try this. We're gonna do like a B sound, and we're gonna go like ba, ba, I should point out that when you're finding your vibrato, it's great to start somewhere in like the middle of your range, middle to low. Too low, and it can be actually a little challenging to get the right kind of spin on the sound, and too high, and you might be a little too tight and actually out of alignment. So find something in the middle. And this is just to feel the placement. So we're not going to do a lot here. But when you do a B, ba, ba, you get this little bit of a sort of plosive feeling. And that we don't want to overdo, of course, like anything. This is a balanced sport. Uh, but as you do that, it's going to help you kind of set down a little more. So it follows with this concept of the neutral larynx. You want to allow that sort of plosive feeling to kind of puff up the space a bit. So you can exaggerate this a little more than maybe you're used to, but just be careful. Doesn't have to be like bah, right? Because that actually might increase tension. So we're just trying to feel that little bit of puff, and I go like ba ba ba. Ba, 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 ba. So it's that sort of draped, kind of relaxed feeling. So the B can be really helpful for that. Um, you can also use an NG sound to feel out the backspace. So again, it's easier for us to focus on the front part of our face and the resonance there, and it's harder to feel the sensation I find in the back. So doing like an NG and kind of sliding around, and you're going to feel more resonance coming from the back of the vocal tract. We're trying to sort of line up our perception with what's happening mechanistically. So going like, and then you can practice sort of opening up on it, like, and you can go back and forth between this and the B, and you're going to feel that puff up feeling. And this also sort of free fall and relaxation of the tongue. So a lot of these tricks, like when we go up to an NG, the tongue is active in the back, and then it relaxes as we go ka. And it's just a way to sort of drop into the right kind of sensation. So that's sort of the trick I find. Instead of sort of thinking like you need to create maximum space, because then what happens is people go like, and they actually lock everything, and that's going to block your resonance a lot of the time. So think of relaxed breath, going like ba ba and nga, nga, ba, nga, nga. And that's going to start to get that feeling of everything sort of being draped and relaxed. Um, that's sort of one side of it, using consonant work, and the other is to use our glides. So our glides always help us find more resonance, and also same sort of concept. We're moving our lips like wah, in the back of our tongue like yeah. And again, this is as opposed to doing this really, really low in our range, I'm doing this sort of more in the middle of my range to really show how and where this occurs really easily. So that's sort of the first trick, is like try this a little bit higher up, not too high, not too low. And so I'm feeling out the positioning. I'm going like pa, nga, ya, ya, wa, wa, ya, ya, listening for that nice sort of ring. Um, so that's the first thing that I would do. The next thing is just to make sure that you've stretched out the mechanism. So I would do some siren slides, going from like ah to e or ah to oo, like we do. So that's going like ah, ah. That's the same thing. We're trying to find that sort of nice, relaxed internal space. And that's actually just stretching out our uh, vocal cords themselves and everything else as the muscles sort of change from the lower positioning to a higher positioning and stretch everything out. So I recommend doing a little bit of that. These are all sort of precursors to finding your vibrato. And the point being is you want to do some stuff to coax your voice into the right place so that it just more naturally occurs, rather than just trying to be like, okay, now I'm going to try vibrato and be like, and try to like shake your head or anything like that. That's usually a sign of forced vibrato. Or there's like too much of a backup of pressure. So it's a little less efficient when you see that happening. So if someone's like, that's usually something getting kind of blocked up, or they're manipulating it too much. So first, just stretch everything out, get it loose. Then, so that's that concept of space. And we're going to keep coming back and forth between these two things, space and spin. So with spin, the concept here is really just our breath pressure. It's getting that pressure to build up so that everything can start to oscillate appropriately. So it's kind of think of it like the push on the swing, right? We want just the right amount of push so that the swing can start to oscillate. That's sort of a nice analogy of what's happening with vibrato singing in general. So a good way to get this right kind of spin, I always do this sort of breath pressure pulsing thing, and then I turn it into a staccato style exercise. So once you got this neutral larynx, try to put a little bit of breath pressure through it, and I'll show you what I mean. And that's essentially what staccatos are. These just sort of short, detached engagements of our voice. And you might notice that you're trying to do it with your head and your neck. So if you're like, ha, ha, that's a sign that you're over manipulating. And instead, ha, 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 you want to lead with your belly, just letting it gently drop down and out. We're never pushing or wrenching at our belly. We're never like, huh, 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 that kind of a thing. If you're coming up and down, you're maybe overworking your support. It's more of like a counterbalance, and it builds up the right kind of pressure underneath your vocal folds. So I might first, if you're having trouble connecting with your support, I might go over some of our support style exercises first to really understand the spin concept. But you can at the very least do some of this breath pulsing, like going like and pushing down and out these gentle little pulses like hi, welcome. So yeah, we're just talking about how to get your vibrato going, and then we'll switch into how to stop your vibrato, because some people actually don't have trouble finding vibrato or getting it going, but actually have trouble controlling it and kind of figuring out how to make it just more dynamic in general. Sometimes more straight tone singing is just more appropriate for the style. So this is the idea. We did a little bit with space to sort of relax and stretch the mechanism, explore what we can do to help feel this sort of internal yawn space by opening and closing it first, just to feel that out, right? Like we just talked about. But ultimately, we want it to be kind of draped and relaxed, and that's going to help us get the right kind of space for resonance and vibrato to occur. So with the spin, we're talking about getting that breath pressure connection, leading with the belly first, and doing that with the breath pulsing. So first going like, and then you can directly turn this into just a staccato style singing exercise and go like, ha, 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 ha. Again, I've got that nice sort of placement like, ba, nga, nga, ya, ya, wa. And then I go, ha, 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 ha. And the last one, I kind of lean into it and see if vibrato starts to occur. So you can do this for a little bit and kind of move it around. So be like, ha, 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 ha. Watch for trying to ha, ha, or he, he, he. If anything's trying to change too much externally, then you might be over manipulating and blocking that vibrato from happening. So again, like ha, 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 he, 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 he. And the point being here again is I'm tapping onto it, testing it out like an accelerator pedal, and then I'm leaning into it when I start singing the more sustained note. So like, he, 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 he. That starts to get the ball spinning, so to speak. So that's one idea. You can just move this around gently, like ha, 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 he, 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 ho, 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 ho. And you can try it out with different vowels. I recommend each one kind of feels a little different, and it might feel like when you're doing like o and oo, that the space is getting more narrow in the front. Try to keep the back still relaxed, like our ba, nga, oh, oh, and you're still going to get nice vibrato happening. So that's sort of the idea there. Then we can start to add these two things together. So we did something particularly for finding space and setup, something for spin, and then I might, as we know, vibrato tends to happen towards the ends of the phrases. It might be because we're not thinking about it as much and holding on and sort of letting our voice naturally sort of decompress and float. But you can take this pulsing thing, test out like that, then do a glide like ya or wah, and let it descend down and see if your voice starts to oscillate like this. So it's sort of like a checklist, right? I like see out each sort of aspect of it, and then I try to throw them all together. That's really the hack here, is just to kind of feel the elements separately, and then use them in a combined way to see if we can stimulate vibrato to happen. So I'll go like ha 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 wah, like that. So, and then I might do ya. I might go like ha 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 ya. If you're used to vibrato, you can definitely get it to open up on the top as well. As you can see, you can kind of ride that pretty strong. But then just see what happens as you let it go. So I'll slide around like this and be like ha 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 wah. Right, that feeling of active, passive, wah. And then I might do the same thing with ya. Be like ha 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 ya. And I try different vowels. I might do like he 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 way. He 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 yeah. So these are just tricks that work for some people. So we're just trying to get that sort of nice combination of these forces, and then sort of relaxing it towards the end, and just seeing if it just kind of does it on its own and starts to kind of happen. Good, good, good. I'm glad you're starting to sort of see how this all kind of connects. So that can work for a lot of people. I just try to stay very loose about it. Just start to notice what's happening. Maybe even record yourself and see, like, sometimes you might not be aware of when it's happening, and then you notice it in your sound, and that informs you about what the sensation is actually like as it's happening, because it's a subtle feeling. So that's sort of one concept. The other one is to do sort of this thing where we, like, our mind is involved in this. Sometimes as we're trying really hard, right, we tend to get kind of tight around everything. And so sometimes we have to just sort of trick ourselves into vibrato. So some people use like rapidly changing directions as a way to sort of basically kind of hypnotize people into finding it. I find that this actually does help, because a lot of the times when people aren't getting vibrato, they're pressing too hard or kind of being too forceful with the sound. And that's making the sound too heavy and like locking various things. And we'll talk about some tension release stuff in a second. But this is definitely a trick that a lot of people use. So I might do like something like this, using the glides as well, and kind of thinking about the space. I would go way up, and try to get it to sort of spin at the end by changing directions. Take this a little higher, like way up, way up. So that's sort of like spring loading it, right? It kind of works with the space and spin. We're going way to drop some space, and then ya to drop on the other side, and then moving around, which gives us a little bit of that breath pulse feeling. So it's way up, way up. You can try, you might find that if you're controlling this too much, just to make it sound too perfect, it's getting too slow, like way up. You might get stuck in straight tone versus way up. Let yourself go and see what happens. Even if it kind of chokes up a little bit, totally fine. We're trying to free up the space. So way up, like that. Way up, way up. So lots of repetition like that, and you can start to see that it's spinning. Another one is to sort of bounce the balls, so to speak, a little bit wider, and go like hi 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 hi. Similar kind of concept, right? Sort of defy gravity a little bit. Try to use just your support. Hi 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 hi. And you might start to get that sort of springy, bouncy ball sort of sound on the bottom side of your voice. So these are the ideas. There's lots of ways to mix and match. Like this, way, this one you could do a minor pattern instead, or in this case, it's actually technically a Phrygian pattern, but don't overthink that too much. You go like way, I find that one actually kind of works better for me for some reason because it's a little bit of leaning in and more relaxing on the other side. So I go like way, like that. Way, way, right? So these are these games, and I'll just sort of go back and forth between all the different elements until they start to serendipitously come together. So it might be like ba, ba, slide around, be like getting everything loose and relaxed, and then go like ha 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 ha. One way, hi, 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 so you don't have to sort of sit with these and be like, okay, I need to do each one for 5 minutes and then move on to the next one. That's sort of missing the point in my mind. And it's actually okay to do things a couple times, get a sensation of that feeling, then move on to the next ball and start to kind of juggle them, right? So this is like a complex coordination thing. And so it's really more about juggling different aspects until they all start to come together. So be playful with it. If you find like as you're working on spin that you're losing space, go back to space, right? If you're doing space and you forget about your lower abdominal muscles, go back to some of the spin and try to put them all together. So another thing that tends to block people from resonance is what's happening with their tongue and jaw. One thing we want to do is practice. Actually, we've got lip trills and we've got tongue rolling. Now, these are things that I sometimes avoid in my like core practice because not everyone has good access to either. But if you do, this can be very, very helpful, especially if you have tongue or jaw tension. So with the tongue rolling, when we relax the tongue, it's just going to allow, actually they found with some of the studies that a lot of the oscillation happens at the very, very back part of the tongue. And so we want that area to be pretty relaxed in sort of the root area. And doing this kind of tongue rolling can just help the muscles start to kind of also get into a sort of more relaxed kind of autonomic state. So that's taking your tongue up to your hard palate. It's almost like if you've never done tongue rolls, it's almost like you're saying a bunch of D's and going like, and then you put breath pressure through it. And you can start to slide this around and go like, it's totally fine if it gets kind of stuck. You might notice that it kind of make your tongue tingle and start to get a little more warm and relaxed. So yeah. No worries. I know that sometimes it's hard with all the different time zones, but just come back later once this one's done and it'll be up and running. And you can also go back through it as well. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that we're going to talk about this. And I know you're just probably about to leave, but sort of right after we do some of these tension things, we're going to talk about how to control your vibrato more and sort of what's going on with all of that. Because sometimes, we want more of a plain chant kind of a sound versus our full vibrato thing. So we'll get to that in just a second. So relaxing your tongue. We're trying to do this like. You might find as you add breath pressure that it kind of gets a little locked up. That's because usually the tongue is trying to help with the breath pressure, and we want that to do something separate. That's why the tongue rolls really help. You can also just trying on a static sort of pitch, coming in with different vowels in the roll. So going like ar, ir, ur, sort of sounds like its own weird little language, but that's going to help you. There's all sorts of other things for releasing tongue tension, and there's videos on that. But this one tends to really help actually as people are working on their vibrato. The other one is the lip trill. So that's going like this. this just helps everything sort of relax a little more. So you never want to like try to do it like this where you're super tight with your cheeks. Instead, actually think of it as very draped and going like kind of like the ba sound, like ba ba. So these are all just ways to get things more loose as well, and they also involve a little bit of that feeling of spin. But they're specifically targeted towards getting our lips and our facial muscles more relaxed. Try to keep your jaw relaxed at the same time, and then keeping our tongue relaxed. So all of these things are going to help us. And then you might, after doing all of this, just try out some of the other things. See if you can get your vibrato to happen. So like, you can hear right on that note that sort of is my target in the middle. It's sort of naturally finding its clip and it's spiking the overtones. It's making it louder and more full sounding. So that's sort of the main thing with all of vibrato. And of course, some of it is just patience, working on different aspects of your voice, trying to get everything nice and relaxed as you do it. So consistency of your practice as well. So that's one thing. Now, a lot of us who've done, especially lots of classical music, find that once you get vibrato happening, sometimes it's hard to turn it off. It is a very efficient technique, as long as you're not sort of over pressing into it and going into a wobble, as we'll talk about later. It sometimes it's so easy that we don't think about it at a certain point, and you actually are just doing it the whole time. And I've gone back to recordings and been like, wow, I'm just like way using my vibrato like very liberally. You know, it comes from the classical training, and sometimes you need a conscious effort of turning it on and off. Some tricks for this. Now, this one is interesting. It's a little bit about our mind and its control over everything with our mind as well. So one thing is you just want to practice alternating and sort of breaking the pattern of what's common with vibrato. So like sometimes I'll literally do step by step vibrato to straight tone to the vibrato to straight tone. And just this gets my mind a little more connected to what's happening. Note what it feels like. So I might go like, and then you might try to flip it around. Maybe you go like, what did I do? I went, wah. Now I'll do the other way. So, you might do one of those descending things, try to get vibrato on the top, but not on the bottom, or vice versa. Wherever it tends to happen more often, you just kind of have to put it in check and sort of consciously be aware of it. So like, I might be like, wah, or go, wah. So you'd be surprised what our mind can do once we're aware of things. This may not work for you, but that's one option. Another exercise I'll do, I always like to have different parts to it. This one has 3 parts, and I can play around with which part has vibrato. So I might go like, something like that. You can play around with different vowels. So I'm going straight tone up, vibrato on the top, and then trying to do straight tone back down that time. So like, you realize it takes a lot of focus. Maybe I'll do it the other way around and be like, so you can see it just takes some practice, working that sort of discipline. That's one side. That's sort of the mental aspect. The other aspect is a little bit about registration. And registration, and then also velocity or speed, although that one is a little controversial because you can sing pretty fast and keep sort of vibrato flowing, not necessarily from note to note, but a through line between notes. It's actually not, those don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. But you might find that lots of vibrato, and because it's more of a sustained practice, it tends to slow us down a bit for most people. So that again, that's a little controversial because it's not like you can't do stuff fast with vibrato. Um, but this is sort of something you can do is speed up your exercises. And we'll get to the registration thing in a second, but that can actually help you. So like I might go like way up. Maybe put a little vibrato at the end, but try to keep it moving. So way up, way up. That kind of a feeling. Way up. So that's sort of one thing. There's lots of ways you can do that, right? You could be like, no, yeah, this way. No, ni, no, no, something like that, right? No, ni, no, no. So sometimes the rapid succession of notes will just force you into more of a straight tone technique. The other one, for example, like when we talked about the slide, try to do a slide with vibrato and you'll find it's kind of a little against the general flow of it because we're moving so quickly through different pitches. So I'm like, right? It's actually kind of I can't do it really. Maybe someone else can. Please tell me if that's something that you've been capable of doing. But you'll notice as you do more drastic changes through registration, vibrato is less likely to happen. So right, it's actually really hard to do it like that. So you might do more siren or slide style exercises. And again, if you're not here, I know you it was pretty late, so you probably left. But come back to this, and this is that little seed planted for you. The other thing is just thinking about registration in general. So when we're singing in high chest voice, there's lots of energy that's required. Um, that can often make us start to have a bigger and bigger vibrato, especially if you're used to doing it and you're not narrowing the space too much. Uh, when we switch up into our low head voice, it kind of resets. So, and then as you go up to your higher head voice, you might start to get more vibrato again, just because it's requiring more energy. And again, this is why I said practice this sort of in the middle of your range. You can actually, as you do more light mixing, as you go more towards a soft chest voice as it's going up into head voice, you can start to cut down on the amount of vibrato. So this is really good for like that plain chant sound or also for just contemporary music in general. So what I'm talking about is like, let's say I'm around here, middle C to G, instead of like, no, 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 like trying to go really full into it, like, and that's going to make a lot of vibrato. I might go like, na, ni, and work my way up. So I might go na to ni, and then na, ni, na, na, and I might try to find that nice sort of mix of so you see I'm keeping it really, really light, and that's actually helping me get off of my vibrato a little bit. So easier said than done, right? But that's actually, as you start to find more of your delicate and light mix, you can start to really, really pull back on how much volume and pressure is required. So that's something I highly recommend. You might do exercises that bounce back and forth from chest voice to head voice. And then as I was talking about with mixing, bring them in closer and closer. And that gets harder and harder. So it might first just be like, that sort of more siren-like thing. Then you might start to do like what I did, which is more of a fifth and closer in, like trying to find that nice light. Sort of more breathy sound. And you might even notice that the vibrato that I do have has started to kind of flutter a little more rather than sort of getting that sort of wider, kind of more full sound. So some of it is literally dynamics and registration that helps us. The other one is just trying to be really conscientious about where you're putting vibrato and where you're not putting vibrato. And then, so I was reading through some of the like old vocal pedagogy and like voice science books on vibrato, because that's, you know, part of this is I always want to be like actually following up on sort of the liturgy and sort of what's there. Um, Now, one thing that I thought was a really great quote from one of them is consciously anticipate vibrato even when you're singing straight tone. And I thought that was really, really awesome as a concept. And I let me just pull up which what this was. It's the very famous book called The Structure of Singing. And this is by Richard Miller. So if you can find that if you're interested in doing that kind of reading, but you know it can get a little dense. But there's a whole section on vibrato, and I just love that phrase because this person talks about how vibrato is kind of always present to various degrees, and straight tone is maybe somewhat of a harmful concept. Although this was written a little bit earlier on in a little bit, it's older, right? So they didn't have as much of the contemporary stuff that we do now. But it's just the point being that we never want to completely sort of restrict the muscles. We always want to allow them to oscillate, but we can sort of minimize that more. And I've said a similar concept, which is when we're doing straight tone, I think of kind of being a little more on the onset of my voice and not letting it sort of relax into that sustain so much. So that's what I think, that sort of similar concept of consciously anticipate vibrato even when you're not singing vibrato and you're purposefully trying to do straight tone, and it'll keep you more in a sweet spot. So if I'm like, again, like no, no, it's like I'm just before no. Yes, exactly. By Richard Miller, Structure of Singing. It's like a famous book. You'll find in a lot of things that's cited as sort of the background research. Um, there's lots of different sort of takes on things, and some of the things are maybe a little more outdated because of when it was written. But it's just part of this research is to get a sense of how do people used to describe these things, and what sort of tricks do they do as well. So I am always trying to compile those together. Same thing for here, right? Like, let me know things that have been really, really helpful for you to find your vibrato. The more of this information we have, the better, even if some of it is more anecdotal than like specific studies of what's happening with the muscles. So this concept of anticipating vibrato is really helpful. It's like you're just about to start, like you're no, no, right? If I just press a little more with my support, no, and get that spin going, then it trips into vibrato. But if you think of just sort of right behind that spot, no, no, right? I can actually kind of withhold doing that the entire time. And that gets a little more towards that kind of plain chant, right? Where I'm like, no. In my head, I'm saying, don't do vibrato, don't do vibrato, don't do vibrato. That's part of it. Because if I just, no, then I've already unleashed it, right? So that's another sort of mental kind of trick that tends to be really, really helpful for people, is this concept of thinking about sort of extending your onset and just the anticipation of vibrato, but not quite. So that way it's actually keeping it still close to that balance state, which is just going to give you more flexibility and momentum with your voice without actually getting the vibrato to start happening. So that's that side of things. I'm always amazed that there's always a lot to talk about, and time flies. So the next concept is, what do we do when we manipulate vibrato, and how can we manipulate vibrato, which is really helpful. This is, doing straight tone to vibrato is kind of one of those principles, but sort of on its own, sort of, I think I give it its own category because it's so big and basic. The other side is sort of the rate of vibrato. Now, some people actually try to count the rate of vibrato per second. I find that almost impossible. I mean, I think I get why that people can do this, but it's more about just evenness of vibrato compared to a slower, wider vibrato that we call a wobble on one side, and then a fast and sort of small vibrato called a flutter on the other side. There's other words for this, uh, but this is a way that you can start to kind of get a sense of your voice in general based on how the vibrato is oscillating. So if it's extra wide, it sometimes goes outside of what we consider an acceptable pitch range for vibrato. Again, sometimes it's actually really cool. So it really depends. But if you're like, and your head starts kind of shaking, that's more on the wobble side of things. And we'll talk about how stylistically you can actually make this really, really awesome. But that's right. There's sort of a lot of reasons why that's happening, but it gets wider. Sometimes this happens with age as well. There are particular exercises for older vocalists to help sort of smooth out the vibrato. Um, the other side is the flutter, and this is usually when the space is too small and there's more pressure, and it's sort of narrowed and faster. So hey, hey, it's really hard to sometimes show the full spectrum of this, but there are a number of singers who more naturally have more of a flutter than an even vibrato, or more of a wobble than the even vibrato. And it's all about this interplay of space and spin. So if you're really wide and you don't have good arpeggio support, breath control, and chord compression, you might get more of the that kind of a thing. So you want to do more of the staccato exercises, and you want to add in some things where you go like ga 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 ga. There are a number of singers who do a little more of that kind of wide sound. Um, Sometimes with that vocalist, but I would also say more actually on the sort of R&B side of things. You're gonna get a little more of that. Um, and then the flutter you'll hear in a lot of sort of like fast-paced, kind of highly contemporary kind of sounds. That like hey, that sort of comes in sometimes, and also in jazz, right? You'll see that sort of fluctuation from one to the other. So again, if you have more of that wobble and you're trying to control it, doing more sort of chord compression work, like ga 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 ga, is actually going to help you get a better seal here, so it doesn't sort of have to push a little too hard to get that to seal up. Sometimes we compensate, right, because it's not happening. Um, and then the other thing is just thinking about your core support a little more, your arpeggio, like ha 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 ga 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 ga, and that's going to sometimes help. And then on the side of the flutter, we want to work on more of that space work. So like thinking about like ba ba or any of these things where we try to find that sort of relaxed, draped feeling. The lowered larynx. You might, if you have a flutter, have a higher sitting larynx, and you want to like try to get that to drop just a little bit more. You can't force it. It comes with just time and experience, and the muscles getting more conditioned and relaxed in the right way. Um, but the cool thing that I would say is you can actually practice making your vibrato go towards one or the other and put them together into a lot of cool stylistic elements. And this just happens with tons and tons of different contemporary vocalists of all genres and styles, really. So it's just a range of sort of noticing certain singers who do one more than the other, and being intentional and in control of it. So one thing is I do this words that kind of open, like opa, open, and I use a little more like instead of open, right, where I spread. So more of this sort of tall space, and I'm gonna work on the wobble and go like just a simple single whole step and be like open, open, and try to get bon, a little bit more of that sort of slow down open, open, and you can start to kind of feel how that happens, and play around with that. Right? Open, so it's relaxed support, and a little bit more of that sort of expanding sound. So that's one practice. So thinking anything, any word that's sort of bon, oh bon. You can just do pretty much anything once you get the feeling of like hey, hey, and start to get it to slow down. Um, the other side is practicing sort of the collapsing aspect. So anything where you have a diphthong, you can kind of really get this to speed up. So a word like fly, so you can kind of do a little jazzy thing and be like fly, fly, and as you're collapsing, I lean in a little bit with my support. I know this is getting very technical, but this is sort of a more advanced side of the hacks to get these things to happen. So I'm narrowing, hey, and as I get to vibrato, I lean in with my support as I'm collapsing the space. So it could be like fly, fly, whatever it is, right? Fly, hey. So you can do these together. You know, I could even take the word like open and be like, open. And as I go to, and I close into it, it's going to start to make it flutter. So open. So that's sort of a game. Pun. And just sort of play around with that. It takes some time. Sometimes just the style of singing in general will make this happen more, or going up to a bigger, higher note can make your vibrato start to slow down a little more. And as you kind of come back down lower in your range, be like, you know, like, why, why? And you can start to sort of do that. Play around with it. Again, it's with style. Sometimes you have to just sort of explore, and then things happen more naturally as you're actually singing through a song. Um, Another one is sort of another diphthong that sometimes gets avoided is the o like oi oe sort of sound. This one sometimes people will do, especially in the jazz and pop realm, and it's another sort of narrowing kind of flutter thing. So like a word that where it actually happens is like noise, right? So if I'm like noise, noise, and I kind of go through this sort of overtone change that makes it start to speed up. You might notice that some people do this with words that don't normally have that, and it's a certain kind of style. So they'll go like, you know, a word like for. They might go like foy, 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 noise, and you can start to actually speed things up and get a particular kind of thing. So that's just sort of a thing. Noise for. So that's just all about sort of closing it off, and that's the flutter thing versus opening the space, relaxing the support, and that gets you more of the wobble. Um, so that's a really just fun thing to play around with, and you might notice that you do both back to back. Might be like, hey, why, right, and sort of does a thing as you're sort of becoming more dynamic with your vibrato. So that's sort of that game. It's sometimes it's harder to control than you would think, and so it's just a matter of playing this with this from day to day and starting to see if it responds more without again trying to overly manipulate. So that can be really really tricky. Certain voices have natural predispositions towards more wobble or more flutter, and they're not necessarily bad. That's kind of my big point. It's more just there's a spectrum of how many oscillations there are per second, and there's a middle point. Now, this is, I think, important for everyone is to find sort of your balanced vibrato. And here's sort of an interesting exercise. It's very much just like doing the circle of vowels thing, but I'm trying to notice how my vibrato changes from vowel to vowel. And you might notice that there's actually some fluctuation, and we're trying to trend our voice towards more evenness. So we're going to go through a vowel cycle. You might hear this with the overtones, but we start with oo, then we go o, ah, a, e. So if I'm gonna go like this, like I'm trying to hear the right, like do it the other way. You can go. You might notice that some of them speed up, some of them slow down, and this can be a great way for you to bring a wobble or a flutter into balance. So I can be like, you can hear a big boost of overtones as I'm trying to keep them all in sync and in cycle with each other. And I think it's just really important to note when we talk about resonance, we talk about everything synchronizing in its motion. And that creates this buildup of overtones or resonance. Keeping things relaxed allows them to synchronize and flow and vibrate together. And vibrato is a sort of a product of this happening. So I come full circle. It's a product of healthy singing. When you find that space and resonance, again, it doesn't mean that everything has to be like, because that's sometimes you're blocking things, right? It's just the relaxed internal space. You can even do it with an M or an N or any, certain consonants like. And you're going to get vibrato as well. So it's really more of a balanced state. But you can actually start to kind of hear the evenness as you move from vowel to vowel. And you might notice that it's like, and there's sort of like a spike and a release. And then that's actually a way that you can start to notice that, oh, I'm doing one of those things where I'm kind of opening and closing it, and I'm creating a wobble to flutter sort of change. Like, right. So it can show you just little pushes of pressure can get things to speed up and to slow down. And one great exercise is just to try to find the middle point, and it's actually going to help you understand how you're controlling things. So it's like the circle of vowels. That one I was doing, really trying to show specific vowels, but you could do the actual circle of vowels thing that we practice all the time. Again, more up in your middle sort of part of your register, and just try to see if you can get vibrato happening even as you're gliding around. So like, and it's just sort of a way that I'm practicing evenness despite sort of going through those diphthong changes, which requires sort of subtle calculations that our body's naturally doing. And I'm just consciously focusing on that rate. Now, the cool thing about vibrato is a lot of people report that it's very relaxing. It's soothing for the experience of it as you're actually singing it. And there's probably some really interesting reasons why, hypothesis of sort of that engine kind of sound underneath, right? That can be calming for us. But it also kind of massages and relaxes everything as you start to go deeper and deeper into that sensation. And there's a reason why, for generations, classical vocalists have used this style more or less. Even when people do like plain chant, sort of straight tony things in early music, there's debate on whether or not there was a little bit of vibrato. It just had a slightly different sort of stylistic sound, maybe more agility happening in the voice in general. But you can actually you can find that vibrato is sort of happening throughout the voice generally, and it's because it's healthy and it allows everything to sort of be really efficient in its sustain. So it's something that every singer should learn how to do, even if it's not your core sound. So let's see what we've got here. Oh yeah, okay. These are some great little side questions. I love it. Just sort of finishing off, and that's great. I think we wrapped up this concept for today. Go back and listen through it again, and use it as a checklist and see if you notice your vibrato happening. So humidifiers or nebulizers for the voice. I know lots of colleagues who swear by them and use them all the time. It's definitely healthy and hydrating for your voice. It's kind of the fastest way that you can hydrate especially if you're traveling a lot and you've got sort of altitude shifting and stuff like that. It can be really, really helpful to do. I personally, I've actually been considering getting one at some point, but I don't really use them as much as just sort of steam in general. So, like, I think about when I'm in the shower, sort of warming up and sort of feeling that sensation and just trying to stay generally pretty hydrated. But nebulizers, people swear by them and they're really, really helpful, especially if you find yourself getting dry a lot, getting that sort of tickle in your sound, or if you're just doing a lot of singing. It's a way to keep the voice hydrated, especially in a pinch. So, nothing substitutes just actual hydration of your body in general. So, drinking more water all the time. But I would be a proponent for nebulizers, and humidifiers. That's the same thing, right? If you find yourself waking up dry all the time, you have allergies and things like that, then um, then I recommend that you do those things. So it depends on where you live too, right? That's part of it. But I do think that they're very helpful. Sometimes it can be an expensive thing to add into your practice, so that's why I like to say that you can't do it without. But a lot of professionals actually do have them. So if it looks like it almost looks like a little bit of like an asthma thing, right, where you are sort of like inhaling the steam through this little kind of cartridge like container thing. So definitely can be really helpful. And then as far as enunciation and diction, this is something that I want to do a full sort of thing on, which is consonants and vowel shapes in general, because it's always good to review these mechanics. Now, diction depends on the language, of course. And so, one thing in a lot of vocal arts majors and things like, what that I had is we learn a number of different languages and we go over IPA, which is the International Phonetic Alphabet, and there are actually really good maps of this online. So one thing is you can find them, and maybe I'll come back with that resource at some point. But I'd have to find it again. But there are really great specific ones that where you can click it and it will give someone pronouncing that particular word and you imitate. But the other thing I would say is if you're having trouble being understood in terms of diction, it's not about the force of the consonant, it's about the length of the consonant. That's sort of my biggest and most important nugget of wisdom. So a lot of people in the trying to like be heard more, they start to spit out their consonants. They're like, for the, that kind of thing. One, it's a little fatigue on the voice, but it actually doesn't necessarily help. The thing you want to think about is actually singing into your consonants a little more. So my name is Abram. Right. So that kind of a thing where I'm actually allowing myself to sculpt the consonants as well. So I think in some classical training, we get afraid of using consonants or sort of fully closing off the space. As long as you're not pressing them, you can actually sit with things and be like, my way there. So if you really pause on things, you can. I know these are sort of here I am saying like sort of almost non-comprehensible sentences, just random words. But if you have a particular thing, you can focus on where do you have consonants that are hard to understand, and can you just linger a little bit longer? Um, and then the other thing is making sure that you're actually doing the right vowel shape. So that's this kind of concept of going over your vowel shapes and getting a sense of what makes each vowel ring in the right way. And that's, you could, yeah, sometimes we want a more neutral, sort of under enunciated sound in certain contemporary songs. But if you're trying to be understood, then you actually have to make sure that you're getting the vowel to ring appropriately, especially from far away, and you can really sit with each one. So I do this circle of vowels thing, go over some of my content, uh, and you can actually feel out sort of the zone where your tongue and jaw and lips sort of sit. That sort of gets the vowel to be the way that it needs to be. And it's kind of amazing that we can understand each other from these little flicks and overtones, right? That's really what's happening is the shape is changing and moving around from closed to open. And then there's certain overtones that come out with particular vowel shapes. So, what I would say is slow down, try to find that clear ring of each vowel. And then, actually, as you're singing, if you need better enunciation, you want to actually slow down the consonants And that's going to, just in this example here, as I'm talking, I'm slowing it down and I'm actually shaping it just a little bit longer rather than adding in force. So that I think is more important. But again, there's a lot to be said about actually going over vowels and consonants and the whole world of IPA, which is just so helpful when you're singing other languages. Of course, also listen to people singing things, and that's going to give you a better sense of how to pronounce certain words. And I always like to double check if I can when I'm singing something in a certain language with a native speaker and be like, does that sound weird to you, or does it sound normal? And what part of it sounds weird? And that is just kind of the best way to do it because every language and dialect is different. And it's hard to know if you're doing it correctly unless you speak the language. So those are my 2 cents on all of that. And, I really think that's great that you asked because that's something, even the thing about nebulizers, these are some things I can incorporate into some of the other live streams about vocal health and hydration, and then about consonants and vowels, our main tools that we sing with. So hopefully this has been helpful for vibrato. It's one of my favorite things, actually. I feel like I say that every time, but it's all connected. And vibrato tells you a lot about your voice. So when I'm listening to singers, that's something that I'm paying attention to, and it can tell me how to strategize to help that voice come into balance. Um, yes, I could help you become an opera singer, but what I would say is I also understand and love how to sing contemporary music. So it's a mix of both. And it's about just sort of seeing the spectrum of technical tools that help us achieve one or the other. So that's sort of the idea. But yeah, I do, I also sing classical, which is sometimes we call legit singing. But I think that both are equally valid, and you're going to get the most dynamic voice as you learn how to sort of make choices and switch between the two different kinds of styles and everything in between. So thank you so much, and I will catch you guys next time. I think the next few are going to be with Camille, but I look forward to the next one that I do in a few weeks. So take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your night.